The candles had been burning for 3 hours when Julian Ashworth, Duke of Ravensmere, stood at the center of the Whitmore ballroom and spoke a name that was not Mirabel Ashcroft's. She heard it from near the terrace doors, where the cold draught crept under the glass and lifted the hem of her gray wool gown against her ankles. She had stationed herself there at Lady Whitmore's request, close enough to be useful and far enough from the assembled company to be invisible, which was the precise arrangement a lady's companion was meant to maintain. The room held perhaps 200 guests, and the chandeliers above them burned with the particular extravagance of families who have never needed to count the cost of wax. Mirabel had been counting the cost of most things for nearly 2 years. The name the Duke spoke was Miss Cecily Vane. The room erupted in the measured way that Regency drawing rooms erupt, which is to say that voices dropped rather than rose, and fans unfurled, and the unmarried women who had placed themselves strategically near the Duke's orbit began, one by one, to collect themselves. Some moved toward the refreshment table. Some found sudden interest in the garden view. They withdrew with the practiced grace of women who had spent their seasons learning to absorb disappointment as though it were merely a change in the weather. Mirabel did not move. Lady Whitmore's hand had found her sleeve in the first moment of the announcement, the old woman's fingers pressing with the particular grip of someone who has forgotten she is holding on. And so Mirabel stood where she was and watched the room rearrange itself around the Duke of Ravensmere. She would think about that decision later. It was not strategy. It was not design. It was the simple fact that Lady Whitmore needed steadying, and Mirabel Ashcroft had £32 a year and no other compass than the one that pointed toward the person who required her most. What she did not yet know was that the Duke was watching the one woman in the room who had not moved. Mirabel had come to the season in Lady Whitmore's service 16 months earlier, following her father's death and the subsequent revelation of his debts. The debts had been considerable, and the estate had gone to a cousin by entail, and so Mirabel had folded her father's letters into a small cedar box, sold 3 pieces of her mother's jewelry, and accepted a position that paid £32 annually, and provided a small room on the 2nd floor of Lady Whitmore's townhouse, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden rather than the street. She had brought with her a plain wardrobe, a box of books, and the precise, observant quality of mind she had spent her girlhood learning to keep quiet. She was 24 years old. She was not beautiful in the fashion the season rewarded, which favored pale curls and a certain deliberate fragility. She was dark-haired and direct-eyed, and her face possessed the particular kind of clarity that people tend to call striking when they cannot call it fashionable. The season had not noticed her. This was, she had decided, acceptable. One could not be noticed and invisible simultaneously, and invisibility had its practical advantages. Lady Whitmore was 71 and fond of her ward, a girl of 12 named Philippa, who had arrived at the Whitmore household 3 months ago from a country estate following the death of her mother. Philippa was shy in the way of children who have learned that unfamiliar rooms contain unfamiliar dangers, and she had taken a particular and silent attachment to Mirabel, who did not require her to speak when she did not wish to. The Whitmore Gala was not an occasion for 12-year-old wards, and Philippa had been settled in the upstairs parlor with a supper tray and a book before the guests arrived. But the commotion of the engagement announcement reached even the upper floors, and it was during the precise moment when the room below was absorbing the news of the Duke's intended marriage that Philippa appeared at the top of the servants' stair, white-faced and trembling, having mistaken the sudden noise for something worse. Mirabel saw her before anyone else did. She disengaged Lady Whitmore's hand gently, crossed the passage in 3 quiet steps, and drew Philippa back from the stair's edge, speaking to her in the low, even tone she used when the girl's breathing went shallow. She told her the name of every candle sconce she could see from where they stood. She described the color of Lady Whitmore's gown. She said the names of Philippa's 3 favorite books, slowly, and felt the child's grip on her wrist loosen as the breathing steadied. Neither of them noticed the man in the doorway at the passage's far end. Julian Ashworth had excused himself from the receiving line within 10 minutes of his mother's announcement, which had caught him, if anyone had been watching carefully, in the precise physical attitude of a man who has been told something he did not know was coming. His jaw had held. His face had offered nothing. He had accepted the congratulations of the room with the contained courtesy that had earned him the reputation of a man who felt nothing, and then he had found a reason to move toward the passage. He saw Mirabelle Ashcroft kneeling on the floor of the servants' corridor, her gray gown pooled around her, counting candlesticks aloud to a frightened child. He did not speak. He stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than he would have been able to account for, and then he returned to the ballroom. The next morning, he asked his estate secretary who the woman in gray had been. If there is a story worth telling about the weeks that followed, it lives in the small accumulations, the details that seemed procedural at the time, and only later revealed themselves as the machinery of something larger being built. The Duke of Ravensmere called at the Whitmore townhouse twice in the fortnight after the gala, on both occasions on business ostensibly related to a surveying dispute with Lord Whitmore's estate. Lady Whitmore received him with the pleased confusion of an old woman who could not quite determine why a duke who had been a stranger to her drawing-room for 3 years had suddenly developed such precise questions about property boundaries. Mirabelle served the tea and said very little. He asked her one question during the first visit. He asked whether she had found Lady Whitmore's household agreeable. She said she had, in the tone she used for deflection. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required, and said nothing further. The second visit produced no direct exchange between them at all, and yet Mirabelle was aware, in the way she had learned to be aware of the things the season pretended not to do, that his attention had moved across the room toward her twice, during the half-hour he sat with Lady Whitmore, each time at a moment when she was occupied, and could not have been watching for it. She told herself she was mistaken. Her wound was a specific one, produced by the careful instruction of 2 years of invisibility. The world had decided she was forgettable, and she had absorbed that verdict with the resignation of someone who has no resources left to dispute it. The Duke of Ravensmere was engaged to Miss Cecily Vane, a woman with a dowry of £12,000 and a mother whose social position was the kind Lady Dorothea Ashworth had been engineering toward for 6 years. There was no version of events in which a duke's attention, deniable or otherwise, had any bearing on the life of a lady's companion earning £32 a year. She thought this clearly and precisely each time she caught herself thinking about the way he had stood in the passage doorway and looked at her. Lady Dorothea Ashworth was a woman who had organized her identity entirely around the correct management of her son's life, and she did not require more than 1 week after the gala to identify Mirabelle Ashcroft as a problem requiring management. She arrived at the Whitmore townhouse on a Thursday, unannounced, and asked to speak with Lady Whitmore's companion privately. Lady Whitmore, who was 71, and had survived 3 husbands and 2 seasons of genuine public scandal, allowed it with the equanimity of a woman who trusted the young woman in her employ. The dowager sat in Lady Whitmore's morning room with the particular upright stillness of a woman whose jewels alone cost more than Mirabelle's annual income multiplied by 30 years, and she placed £100 on the table between them in neat folded notes. "You are a sensible woman," she said. "I am told you have been so." Sensible women understand when their situation has reached its natural conclusion. Mirabelle looked at the money without touching it. "You are asking me to leave Lady Whitmore's employ," she said. "I am asking you to consider your circumstances honestly." Lady Dorothea's fan moved once, a single measured stroke. A companion of modest means in a household that visits the Duke's estates and attends the same evening assemblies is a particular kind of inconvenience. The engagement will be formalized before the month is out. There is no advantage in inconvenience for anyone. There is Lady Whitmore's advantage, Mirabel said. She is 71, and her ward is 12, and she requires a companion. The dowager's expression did not change, but something in the room tightened. £100, she said again. That is 3 years of your present wage. Mirabel folded her hands in her lap. She was aware that her heart was beating with the specific rapid quality that her body produced when she was frightened and intended not to show it. I understand what you are asking, she said. You are asking me to confirm that I have been what you believe me to be, which is a woman maneuvering for an advantage she has not been offered. I have not been that. Leaving Lady Whitmore on those grounds would require me to agree with a characterization of myself that is false, and I will not do it for £100 or for 300. She stood. She said, I am sorry to have wasted your time, my lady, and she left the morning room. The dowager sat for a moment after the door closed, and the single short thought that moved through her was that the girl was going to be more difficult than she had estimated. You will find, if you have ever sat with a story like this one and felt the pull of it in your chest, that the difficulty is never the villain's cruelty. It is the waiting, the patience required to stay where you are when the machinery around you is turning and grinding, and you cannot see what it is building. If Mirabel's quiet act of value speaks to something you recognize, stay with her a little longer. The best of what she is has not yet been seen. The library at Ravensmere was not a room Mirabel was supposed to have entered. Lady Whitmore had accepted an invitation to stay at the estate for a fortnight in late October. The visit framed as a courtesy related to the surveying matter, and Mirabel had come as companion with the same functional invisibility she carried everywhere. She had been awake before dawn on the third morning, unable to sleep for the cold that crept under the door of the small room she had been given at the corridor's end. And she had taken her candle and gone looking for something to read. She found the library by following the smell of old paper, which has its own particular warmth that cold corridors do not suppress. Julian was already there. He was seated at the library table with a single lamp and an open ledger, not reading it, his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the dark window at the room's far end. He did not hear her at first. She stood in the doorway for the 3 seconds it took to understand she had made a mistake. And then he turned. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Miss Ashcroft, he said at last. Your Grace. She began to withdraw. I apologize. I did not realize the room was occupied. It is a library, he said. It is meant to be occupied. He paused, and the pause had something in it she could not name. Stay, if you wish. I am not reading. She should not have stayed. She stayed. What they said to each other in the following hour was not, in the way of things that matter most, entirely rational. He asked her what she had been looking for, and she named the volume, A Natural History of the Yorkshire Dales, published 20 years prior, and he found it on the second shelf without needing to search, which told her something about the room's organization and about him. She asked him why he was awake, and he said he slept poorly, in the even tone of someone reporting a fact rather than soliciting sympathy. She accepted the answer without pressing it. He asked her once whether she missed the house she had grown up in. The question caught her unprepared. She was quiet for a moment, and he did not fill the silence, which was itself a kind of courtesy she had not expected from him. Yes, she said. I miss the library most. My father had a reasonable collection for a man of modest means, and the room smelled of his pipe tobacco and old Morocco leather. and I have not been in a room that smelled like that since he died." Julian said nothing. He looked at his hands on the ledger, and something in his face shifted in a way she could not see clearly in the lamp's low light. She did not know then what she learned later. She did not know that 4 years before the season now turning, his first wife had died in childbed on a morning when he was in London on business he had believed could not wait. He had received the letter 8 hours after she was gone and had arrived at Ravensmere to a house already in mourning. He had put her portrait to the wall himself, not from lack of grief, but from the kind of grief that cannot be looked at directly. The coldness that the season read as his character was not his character. It was the shape that grief takes in a man who has decided, quietly and without announcement, that presence costs too much, and distance is the only thing that protects the people near him from the damage he carries. He had believed that for 4 years. He had been wrong for 4 years. And something in the way a woman in a gray gown counted candlesticks for a frightened child in a darkened passage had begun, without his permission, to erode the belief. He did not tell her any of this in the library at dawn. He closed the ledger and said good night, and she took her book and her candle and returned to the cold corridor. At the door, she paused, because the specific quality of the silence behind her was one she had not encountered before, and she turned to find him looking at her with an expression she would spend the next 2 weeks misreading. She read it as courtesy. The audience knew better. Lady Dorothea escalated in the way of people whose first instrument has failed and who reach for a sharper one. She could not remove Mirabelle from Lady Whitmore's service by bribery, and she could not remove her from the season's orbit by social machinery alone, because Lady Whitmore was the kind of elderly woman whose long acquaintance with the peerage gave her an insulation the dowager could not easily penetrate. What Lady Dorothea could do, and what she did, was produce a letter. The letter was shown first to Miss Cecily Vane, who was 22 years old and had been raised to understand that her marriage to the Duke of Ravensmere was not merely her family's aspiration, but its financial necessity, and who had therefore developed a precise and cold understanding of threats to that marriage. Cecily read the letter with the expression of a woman reading a strategy rather than a document, and she understood what it was and what it was meant to do. The letter was then placed where the assembled drawing-room at Ravensmere could see it on the evening of the 3rd week, during a gathering of the house party that included Lady Whitmore, her ward Philippa, the Vane family, 3 neighboring landowners, and a solicitor named Mr. Aldous Beach, who had arrived that afternoon on business related to the estate's unresolved surveying matter. The letter, as Lady Dorothea presented it, was written in a hand that resembled Mirabelle's, and it described, in careful terms, a scheme by which a companion of modest means had used her proximity to the Whitmore household to manufacture opportunities for the Duke of Ravensmere's attention, with the purpose of supplanting the engagement to Miss Vane and securing for herself a position of greater fortune. The drawing-room read it in the specific silence of a company that has been handed a piece of paper and asked to render a verdict without deliberation. Mirabelle stood at the room's edge and felt the familiar cold draft of a world that had decided, once again, what she was. "A fortune hunter," Lady Dorothea said, to no one in particular, which meant to everyone. It is not a comfortable thing to say aloud, but a companion with £32 a year and no prospects has a particular motive that more fortunate women are not compelled to act upon. The label was not new. Mirabelle had heard its first form 2 weeks earlier from the mouth of one of the Vane cousins at the Whitmore tea. A provincial, someone had said, which meant a woman without the connections to defend herself. She had heard it again at the edge of the Ravensmere dining room, from a guest who had spoken to another guest in a voice calibrated to carry. The companion, someone had observed, who does not know her place. This was the third voicing, and it was the most precise, and it landed in the drawing room with the weight of something that would not be easily unsaid. Julian stood at the fireplace. His face gave nothing. Mirabel did not look at him. She looked at the letter in Lady Dorothea's hand and felt the specific clarity that arrives in a person when the last pretense has been stripped away and only the truth remains available. "That letter is false," she said. The room was very quiet. "I did not write it, and I did not seek the Duke's attention. I sought Lady Whitmore's comfort and her ward's, and I have done the work I was employed to do. I cannot prevent this room from believing otherwise. I can only tell you what is true." She looked at Julian then, because he was the only person in the room to whom the truth was owed directly. His eyes were on her. She could not read them. "I will not remain in a house that requires me to defend my character against a forgery," she said. "I am sorry to inconvenience you, Lady Whitmore." She set down her wine-glass with the careful precision of someone who will not allow their hands to shake in public, and she walked out of the drawing-room and out of Ravensmere into the cold October evening, because it was the only thing left to do that she could do with her dignity intact. And dignity was the only thing she had that no one had yet found a way to take from her. Lady Whitmore watched her go. Philippa, who had not been meant to witness any of it, but had crept to the drawing-room door in the particular fashion of quiet children who go where they are not expected, pressed her face against the door-frame and said nothing. Julian Ashworth stood at the fireplace and said nothing either, and the room filled the silence with the soft resumption of its own conversation, because rooms do this when the discomfort of a scene passes and the hierarchy reasserts itself as the natural order of things. What no one in the room saw except Mr. Aldous Beach, who was seated near the window with the attentive stillness of a man who has spent 30 years watching people do things they will later wish they had not done in front of a solicitor, was the Duke's expression in the 4 seconds after Mirabel left the room. It lasted exactly that long. Then the face composed itself again, and Julian Ashworth crossed the room to his mother and said, in a voice no one else could hear, "Show me where this letter was obtained." The following evening's assembly was held at the Whitmore townhouse, a gathering of the season's remaining company before the cold of November closed the last of the autumn parties. Mirabel had returned to Lady Whitmore's employ at that woman's specific and firm request, delivered the morning after in a note that contained no discussion of the previous evening's events, and simply said, "I require you at the assembly. You are not dismissed." Mirabel had smoothed the note on her knee and looked out the kitchen garden window for a long moment before folding it and placing it in the cedar box with her father's letters. She dressed in the gray gown and arrived at the assembly in the functional invisibility she had learned to carry as a kind of armor, stationed herself near the wall at the room's edge with a glass she did not drink from, and watched the company arrange itself for the evening. Miss Cecily Vane arrived in white silk trimmed with seed pearls, and she was everything the season rewarded, pale and composed and perfectly dressed, with a mother at her shoulder whose expression was one of careful, determined confidence. The dowager arrived separately and took her customary position near the room's center, which was her preferred vantage point and her preferred statement of authority. The room moved around her in the particular way of rooms that understand where its center of gravity is. Mirabel was aware of Julian's entrance only because the room's arrangement changed when he arrived, the way the air in a space adjusts to accommodate a different pressure. She did not look at him directly. She looked at the candle in the sconce nearest her hand and counted the seconds between the wax strips. She heard, rather than saw, the moment the room changed. It was the sound of the company noticing something. not a gasp. Nothing so theatrical. It was the specific dropping of multiple conversations at once, the sudden awareness of a room holding its collective breath, and when Mirabel looked up, she saw Julian Ashworth crossing the ballroom floor in 3 strides. The company parted without knowing they had done it. He walked with the particular controlled velocity of a man who has made a decision and ceased to negotiate with himself about it, and he was looking at her, and only at her, with an expression she could no longer misread. He stopped in front of her. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Oakes, the Ravensmere housekeeper who had come to the assembly as Lady Whitmore's invited guest, stood 20 feet away at the room's edge with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen, and has now seen it begin. "The letter was my mother's composition," Julian said, in a voice calibrated precisely for the room to hear. "It was not written by you. I knew its provenance before you spoke last evening, and I permitted it to stand a moment longer than I should have, which is a fault I intend to remedy now." He did not reach for her hand. Not yet. He stood at the distance of formal address and spoke with the directness of a man who has learned that the only language a drawing room cannot ignore is the truth stated plainly by the person with the most to lose by stating it. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "I am asking, before this company, whether you will consent to receive my suit." Mirabel looked at him. Her heart was doing something specific and rapid in her chest. Across the room she could see Lady Dorothea's face in the process of its rearrangement, the architecture of confidence shifting as the social order it was built on shifted beneath it. Cecily Vane stood with her mother, and her expression was the expression of a woman reading a page that has turned without her. It was not cruel. It was simply the end of a script she had believed was the only one in the room. "The engagement to Miss Vane," Mirabel said carefully. "Was announced," Julian said, "before any formal articles were signed. Mr. Beach can confirm there is no legal instrument. My mother made the announcement without my knowledge or consent on the evening of the Whitmore Gala. Mr. Aldous Beach, standing near the refreshment table with his glass held with professional neutrality, inclined his head in the spare confirming manner of a solicitor who has spent 30 years being the most precisely timed presence in a room. "There were no articles executed," he said. "No legal instrument exists." The room absorbed this with the sound of 200 people recalibrating everything they thought they had understood about the last 6 weeks. Cecily's mother moved toward the dowager and said something in a low voice that carried a specific and cold precision. Lady Dorothea received it without moving, her fan held at its customary height, but the confidence in her posture had changed in a way the room could see even if it could not name. Something had been displaced. The authority she carried as the Duke's mother and the arbiter of his choices was still present, but it had been corrected, publicly, by the very person whose choices it had presumed to manage, and the correction was permanent because it had been witnessed. She departed the assembly within the hour. Not in retreat. She would not have allowed herself that. She departed with the measured grace of a woman who has recognized that the field has changed, and that the only dignity remaining is in leaving it well. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, the particular kind of accommodation that a woman of Lady Dorothea's intelligence and self-awareness was capable of making when the evidence became undeniable. And if it was not an apology, it was at least an acknowledgement. Mirabel was still looking at Julian. "The offer is genuine," he said. The sentence was short and level and carried the weight of someone who has discarded all the prepared language and arrived at the only words that were true. "I am not a man who performs feeling easily. I am telling you that what I witnessed in the passage at the Whitmore Gala 6 weeks ago and what I have observed since has produced in me a certainty I did not expect, and cannot, in honesty, set aside. She thought about the library at dawn. She thought about the question he had asked her, whether she missed the house she had grown up in, and the way he had sat with her answer without trying to manage it. She thought about 4 years of a portrait turned to a wall, and £32 a year, and a cedar box of her father's letters, and the kitchen garden window, and the cold draught under the terrace door at the Whitmore Gala, and the particular clarity that had settled in her at the drawing-room door the previous evening. That dignity was the only thing she had left that no one had found a way to take. She had kept it. He was not asking her to give it up. He was asking her, in front of 200 witnesses, and his mother's displaced authority, and a solicitor with a glass of wine, whether she would allow herself to be seen. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet enough that only he heard it, and the room around them filled again with the soft resumption of its own life, rearranged and still settling, the way a room does after the most important thing has happened, and the lesser things are finding their new places. He offered his arm. She took it. Mrs. Oakes, 20 feet away, looked at her hands and pressed her lips together against a smile she had no intention of suppressing. The weeks that followed belonged to the private machinery of a life being rebuilt. Mr. Beach confirmed the legal path forward with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has drafted marriage settlements for 3 decades, and the settlement he drafted for Mirabelle Ashcroft contained provisions that would have bewildered her had she seen them in any prior version of her life. A personal income, a claim on the lesser Ravensmere property in Yorkshire, and a clause that was Julian's specific addition, providing for Lady Whitmore's household to receive a quarterly sum sufficient to employ not 1 companion but 2, for as long as Lady Whitmore required them. Mirabelle had read that clause sitting at the Ravensmere library table, in daylight this time, with Julian across from her and the natural history of the Yorkshire Dales on the shelf where she had found it on the dawn of the 3rd week. She had looked up at him and said nothing. He had looked back at her and said nothing. The silence between them was the kind that does not require filling. Lady Dorothea wrote a letter. It arrived at the Ravensmere townhouse addressed to Mirabelle directly, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. And it was not warm, but it was precise and honest in the manner of a woman who has never lacked for intelligence, and has finally brought it to bear on her own conduct. It noted that she had acted from love for her son and from a conviction that the structure she had spent 20 years building for him was the correct one. It noted that she had been wrong about Miss Ashcroft's character. It did not use the word apology, but it contained the substance of one in the specific sentence that read, "I misjudged what my son required, and I hope in time to correct that judgment in person." Mirabelle read it twice. She placed it in the cedar box with her father's letters, which were in good company. Philippa arrived at Ravensmere for the Christmas fortnight at Lady Whitmore's arrangement, and she stood in the entrance hall with her traveling bag and her wide gray eyes moving across the height of the ceiling with the expression of a child encountering a space that is both frightening and beautiful. Mirabelle was waiting at the foot of the stairs. She said Philippa's name, and the child crossed the hall and took her hand, and the exchange was simple and complete, and required nothing further from either of them. Mrs. Oakes, who had been housekeeper at Ravensmere for 22 years and had outlasted 2 countesses, a renovation, and 1 extended period during which the family silver had been locked away and no one would explain why, welcomed Mirabelle with the specific warmth of a woman who had watched the house turn cold and had been quietly waiting for the warmth to return. She showed her the linen room, the winter garden, the passage that connected the library to the morning room without requiring the crossing of the great hall, and she said, at the end of the tour, that she hoped the house would suit. Mirabel said she believed it would. Snow came at the end of November, arriving early as it does in North Yorkshire, where the hills hold weather longer than the valleys expect. It came on a Thursday evening, first as a fine gauze against the library windows, and then as something more deliberate, settling on the stone sill and the kitchen garden and the long avenue of bare elms that ran from the gate to the house's front door. Mirabel stood at the library window and watched it. Julian came to stand beside her. He did not speak at once. He had learned, or perhaps always known, that silence between people who trust each other is not an absence, but a kind of presence, and he offered it now the way he offered most things, without announcement. On the library wall, facing the room as it always had faced it, was the portrait of his first wife, restored to its proper place. She was fair-haired and serious in the portrait, with the expression of a young woman who had understood the weight of the life she was undertaking. Julian had rehung it himself the previous week, on a morning when the house was quiet, and Mrs. Oakes had found some reason to remain in the kitchen wing. Mirabel had not asked him to. He had told her afterward, simply, that it was the right thing to do, that the portrait's absence had been a form of punishment he had invented for himself, and that he no longer believed was accurate or useful. She had said nothing then, only looked at the portrait for a long moment, and then at him. Now the snow fell past the window, and the library fire burned at the room's center. And Philippa was somewhere upstairs with a supper tray and the third volume of a series she had been refusing to finish because she did not want it to end. Mrs. Oakes was at the threshold of the hall, her rounds complete, her lamp held low. The portrait on the wall held its even gaze over a room that had been remade without erasing what it was before. Mirabel set her hand on the cold glass of the window, feeling the winter press against her palm from the other side. She had £32 a year once, and a kitchen garden window, and a cedar box of letters from a man she had loved and lost, and a wound the season had delivered with such practiced efficiency that she had almost come to believe it was the truth. She had almost believed she was forgettable. She had almost believed no one would choose her freely. Julian's hand came to rest beside hers on the glass. The snow went on falling past the window, white and unhurried, onto the stone sills and the bare elms and the long avenue leading home. This was home. She was in it. If Mirabel's story has settled somewhere in your chest this evening, leave a word in the comments about the moment that found you. The stories that matter most are the ones that remind us what quiet courage looks like, and this one was yours to sit with for as long as you needed it.